For the last few years, I have been traveling to Cowpens National Battlefield. Not only does it remind me of walking here when I was younger with my mother, but it truly is an easy and peaceful place to walk. However, I would be lying if I said that genealogy didn't have a lot to do with all of my visits. In fact, when I first got into looking up my ancestry, I linked myself to Nathaniel Byers. But after finding his grave on the Cowpens property, I found out that that might not be correct, as I could not find any real documentation about his alleged daughter. That was my first lesson on not just believing anything that I read on Ancestry. Fortunately, last summer I found another reason to keep my annual Cowpens visit. This reason happened by chance while trying to find the grave of my true ancestor, Hidge Mosley. During my journey of finding his grave, I discovered the historical fiction Ford the Pacholet, which is a Revolutionary War novel culminating in the pivotal Battle of Cowpens. In addition, not only did this book talk about my ancestor Hidge, but William Hodge, who is also my kin. While I realize that this book is historical fiction, it is now truly one of my most treasured items because it really helped me put myself in my ancestors' shoes. For this book, the author, Richard C. Meehan Jr., did win the Southeastern Writers Association Award. In addition, a former park ranger of Cowpens named John Robertson reviewed the book and stated, "The historical accuracy behind this fictional tale is definite. I liked switching from my historian role to simply enjoying an excellent story." As I mentioned in my Hidge Mosley vlog, this book is about a teenager named Lim, who after several events ends up befriending a Catawba girl, after which they both end up traveling with Daniel Morgan on his way to Cowpens. Again, while this book is fiction, it does give brief descriptions of the characters in the back. As for my relatives, it reads, William Hodge, the owner of Hodge Plantation at Grindales. He was known as a true Whig and a friend to Jack Beckham. In Major Joseph McJunkin's memoirs, Hodge was paid a visit by Tarleton directly after the Battle of Blackstock's Farm on November the 20th of 1780. Tarleton was pursuing Whigs from the battle. He chased them to Glendale Shoals and came to Hodge's house. The British commander took Hodge prisoner. In addition, the British seized possessions and killed Hodge's livestock, as well as burned his house. While carrying him off, Tarleton told Hodge's wife that they would hang him on the first tree in the road. However, that did not occur, and Hodge was jailed in Camden, South Carolina. In regards to Hidge, the book states, Hidge's given name was James Thomas Mosley Sr. He was a backwoodsman, an Indian fighter, a childhood friend of Daniel Boone, a scout for Daniel Morgan, and a blacksmith and dentist. He lived on Sandy Run Creek, a tributary of the Pacholet River just below Glendale's Ford. His nickname came from his high-pitched singing voice. During the Revolutionary War, he served in the 2nd South Carolina Militia under Colonel Thomas Brannan. His occupation meant 60 years of shoeing horses and pulling teeth, which paid for the keeping of his 12 children. Most notably in this book, it discusses how Hidge was run up a tree by a pack of wolves. In this vlog, I'm going to talk about what the book Ford the Pacholet says about Hidge. The first time Hidge is mentioned is in chapter 2 on page 12. Lem recalled his last taste of pork this past fall. Mr. James Mosley and several of his hunting friends had shot an enormous boar on Friday eve. The men had stayed up all night smoking and seasoning the meat. The following morning, they sent runners to invite the whole church congregation up to the Sims Marchbanks meeting house for a pig picking that afternoon. By then, the meat was falling off the bone. Papa had sent Lem ahead to help with the preparations. Womenfolk came laden with platters of boiled vegetables, such as new potatoes, onions, and corn on the cob. There were heaps of biscuits and fresh butter. Tables were thrown up and set. A barrel of ale was tapped for the pouring. Porches were posted and readied for sunset. Up and down the river, folks began to arrive in their best livery, by carriage, horseback, or afoot. No plates or utensils were needed. Like the kings of old, Lem and others enjoyed delving fingers into the moist, warm, hickory-smoked boar. He remembered licking his fingers clean of the savory juices, then digging into the tray of vegetables. Ale flowed, and there was music and dancing. A bonfire was laid once bellies were full, and several veteran Indian fighters began talking about old times. The high-pitched voice of Mr. James Hidge Mosley plied even the dullest of listeners with tales of daring do against the red heathens. Lem heard how the Cherokee had been pushed from Glendale Shoals down to Tougaloo near Georgia. The Catawbas were driven up to Rock Hill. He had never seen any Indians at Glendale's, but many elders had. The next time Hidge is mentioned is in chapter 3 on page 24, 28, and 29. This first occurs as Lem is talking with a couple of girls. Besides a little blacksmithing and teeth pulling with those homemade tooth pinchers of his, the best one can say of Uncle Jack is he knows how to pull a cork. Why, just last week, Uncle Jack yanked out a perfectly healthy canine out of old Mr. Hames' mouth, and then had to pull the offending molar to boot. If Mr. Hames hadn't gotten into the water of life himself on the pretense of dulling the pain, he would have had a good case against Uncle Jack. As it is, he didn't know a thing about it until the next day. By then, Uncle Jack and Captain Hampton were out hunting. Lily Beth's voice raised in pitch. "Too bad Auntie Mary left you on the doorstep when your family packed up and went back to Boonesboro last April." Angelica spat. "At least my pa died a hero fighting the Indians. He helped save a lot of settlers at Big Creek Fort without pulling a cork." The next time you hear about Hidge is when Lem and the girls are at his father's store. "Henry," said Mr. Chasm, "till now the Loyalists have left your property alone. That's not to say your luck can last forever. We must stand together and put an end to the Tory looters hereabouts, once and for all. If we don't, more stalwart Whigs like Knuckles will die." "Aye, Henry," said a new treble voice that could only be Private James Hidge Mosley. "Why, it was a week ago today that a band of them ruffians came by my place and killed all me chickens whilst I was out scouting around for General Dan. They dragged me poor wife, Nancy Ann, into the yard by her hair, they did. Suppose that party of 2nd Regiment lads hadn't passed by, there's no telling the mischief them Tory scalawags would have done. You have my sympathies, Hikey, but times a being what they are, I can't afford to pick and choose my customers. How can I do otherwise? The next time Hikey's name is written is in Chapter 4. Lem had once heard Gentleman Thompson quoting Governor Henry from the pulpit in the meeting house, "Give me liberty or give me death." Thompson would follow up with tales of how he had fought with Henry to run Lord Dunmore out of Virginia. That had happened 15 years ago, and still Gentleman Thompson spun a good yarn for eager ears. Master Hodge, Captain Chasm, Jack Beckham, Adam Goodlock, and old Hikey Mosley were rugged frontiersmen who had driven the Cherokees out of Glendale. Now they were urging the community to stand together against their Tory neighbors. Lem had heard all the arguments concerning the cause of liberty. It was the main topic at any gathering. The next time Hikey's name is written is in Chapter 5 on page 43. Lem sat on a gunny sack of cornflake at the edge of the outcrop. He shoved the last pickled egg in his mouth and washed it down with a swig from his canteen. This ridge overlooked the boggy areas that paralleled the river. It was his favorite spot for taking a break. He held his face to the warming rays of the afternoon sun. Ancient water oaks along the river banks clutched at the wintry blue heavens. Only the pitched pines held any color. The dark green needles seemed to yearn for springtime. Bo, tied off yonder to Mosley's tree, snorted in pleasure while calmly munching on a handful of corn. If the mule had heard the tale of the wolves that chased Mr. Mosley up that tree last fall, he wouldn't be so content. With a sigh, Lem stood and stretched. It was time he got back on the road to Christie's. In addition, Hikey is mentioned again in Chapter 5 on page 45. This occurs as Lem is frightened. Lem never again wanted to see such fury in Papa. He decided to make his delivery first and then bolt for home. Lem felt almost overwhelmed with the desire to flee, but people might think him chicken-hearted if he did. Was Mr. Mosley a coward for letting those wolves chase him up a tree? Certainly not. The hunter was saving his own skin. These and other thoughts plagued Lem as he lifted the sack to make his way back to Bo. Then in Chapter 16 on page 155, Hikey's name shows up again. Lem had already been at John's Hill for several minutes before realizing what Sookie had said. The words would have been burned into his guts like molten lead. What happened to Papa? Catching up to Private Foster, he asked, "Have you any word from my family?" "Shoot, no," Foster said. "Have you been hiding under a rock?" "Everything's been in a terrible fuss these last few days, ever since that ne'er-do-well Jack Beckham came through Glendale this Sunday past. He was riding his big black mare at full bore, clay pipe stuck in his mouth as if it was Gabriel's horn. Cotched a group of us huddled up around the hearth at your papa's store, trying to keep warm. Recollected to me of Paul Revere, he did, hollering about the British a-comin'. Of course, we knew they'd be coming by land. Before we could say boo, Jack was back on Maul and lit out again, straight for General Dan. We were all astir, let me tell you. Every able-bodied man went straight home to get his musket and bid his family a farewell. Last I saw of Henry, he was trying to sidle old Private High Key out the door so he could head for home his own self. In this book, the last time that High Key is mentioned is in Chapter 20, which is named Preparations. McJunkin stalked towards Lem, Park at his heel. The corporal and his torchmen rounded the house to choose a beast for slaughter. As the major and sergeant joined Lem astride their mounts once more. "All's well that ends well, so they say," McJunkin observed. "Ye gods, my very bones ache of weariness, sergeant. Let us away to find our lodging and take refreshment." "Aye, sir," Lem and James chorused. The road led straight to Pickens' militiamen as described. McJunkin brought them to the nearest bonfire. Upon seeing no officer's tent, he reared up in his saddle, cupping his hands to his mouth, and summoned a strength of lung from where Lem knew not. "Second Spartans, sound off!" Far to the right they came. "Halloos!" A high-pitched voice cut out through the din, none other than that of High Key Mosley, best of the Carolinas. The sing-song announcement set off a round of chants that began as "Carolina, Carolina." Those near Lem countered with "Pickens, Pickens." Soon others could be heard echoing across the field and filtered through the scattered trees. "Howard, Howard, Triplet, Washington, 71st Cavalry," and many more individual companies sounded off. Lastly, I will be reading some of page 198 and 199. Sergeant Brennan spoke. "Park, my good fellow, 'tis my brother's wish for entertainment. Let us away from these fine people. I have yet to introduce Lem to his fellows, and time flies." With that, all those gathered were escorted to Colonel Brandon's presence and made comfortable at his fireside. All excepting Lem, he was a different plight. As the group passed before Sergeant Brandon's tent, the sergeant grabbed Lem's arm to hold him back. Rummaging to retrieve Lem's drums, he said, "Here 'tis, Lem, your instrument of office. Didst Park make mention that ye have a bit of rank to your name by holding this here thumper?" "Nay." "Well then, hear ye. Any of the ranks of private is at your command, young Lem. Call it professional courtesy, since ye be engaged at odd times while the rest of us be off duty. Drummers fall between privates and corporals. Ye have the right to a morsel of assistance once upon a time, but don't think ye to abuse your newfound influence. Now let's be off to serve at the colonel's pleasure." Lem was shaken. That answered the question that had been burning in his mind. Privates Mosley, Foster, and Gilham had all been compelled to see to his needs. It had not occurred to him the reason was beyond simple gentry. He hung the shoulder strap over his neck and adjusted the drum to his right hip. He withdrew his drumsticks from their sheath. "Song! I want a song!" demanded Colonel Brandon. Into the circle came two men carrying their instruments of trade. The first was a crumpled old man, clean-shaven, with thin, yellowish hair and a few teeth. He clutched a handmade wooden fife with his claw-like fingers. The other was a decade younger, perhaps, and darker of countenance as Lem himself. His hair was black and stringy, creeping from underneath a flat, moss-colored Scottish bonnet. From his shoulders dangled a field drum, not unlike Lem's. "Where be my greenest drummer?" demanded Colonel Brandon. "Go on now. Ye have been summoned." Park reached over Sookie and Sally to propel Lem into the firelight. A fright came upon him, what with all the eager stares. 'Twas his first performance before an audience, nor had he the full training. His new companions acknowledged him with cordial nods. Then the tall drummer ticked off a cadence. Lem raised his own sticks and struck a simple beat. He was rewarded with a smile from his new partner. After a few bars, the old man raised his fife to his lips. He blew a piercing melody Lem immediately recognized, "Free America," an old ballad by Joseph Warren. The men around the fire raised their voices in song. Both musicians clapped Lem upon the back when the tune had ended. The oldster called himself Jake Polk, and the one of middle years, Chand Aubrey. They laid it out plain how good it was for Lem to join their little band, offering heavy praise upon his novice drumming. Lem warmed to them graciously. For some while to come, the soldiers implored more music. Wood was thrown on the fire, many a cup was filled. When Lem looked around, he realized that the crowd had grown. Militiamen throughout the camp had wandered in to lend their voices to the tunes. They took what cheer they could on the eve of battle. This notion stirred Lem to his core. The firelight swam in his sight until he wiped the moisture away with his sleeve. "'Tis a dance we have need of," exclaimed the colonel. Immediately the crowd took up the chant, "A dance, a dance, a dance." Lem looked to his fellows unsure. "Just keep the tempo, Lem. That's all you've to do," hollered Jake over the chanters. He bobbed his head to the beat, so Lem struck the drumhead in tempo. Chand Ashbury added flourishes and drags. When several cadence measures suited Jake, he launched into a popular ditty that brought cheers, whistles, and claps. All around men linked arms and spun. Park hooked both Sookie and Sally and lumbered into circles, laughing. Laughter and gaiety abound. Lem's weariness vanished as he became enamored with the music. As the dance ended, scouts came from the back in throngs. "The general's a-comin'! The general's a-coming! The general's a-coming! Make way for General Dan!" Versions of the notice made its way all the way to the fireside, at which point Colonel Brandon commanded, "Drummers, give the roll." Lem observed as Chand tapped out a continuous tempo, the strokes that he had not yet mastered, but seeing it done, mimicked the best he could. All eyes were now fastened upon the center aisle. The militiamen parted to each side, as did the Red Sea by God's power through the outstretched arms of Moses. Cheers announced the arrival of General Dan and his entourage. Many firebrands were held aloft to light his way. Snatches of the general's banter reached Lem's ears as a hush gradually fell over the crowd. "Keep in good spirits. The day will be ours. The old wagoner will crack his whip over Ban in the morning, as sure as I live. So a pretty maiden awaits you back home. 'Tis a boast, sir, a boast. All I ask of ye is just hold up your head, boys. 3 fires and you are free." The general came to the fireside, greeting Colonel Brandon and his officers. After shaking a few hands, he turned back to the men. It was then his eyes lit upon Lem. "Ah, well met, young Lemuel. Making a mark for yourself, I see. Maidens do adore a man who can play his instrument with a lively beat." Lem's face heated as the crowd roared. Morgan raised his arms for attention. "Hold your tongue, and I'll tell you a tale," he began. Many of you know I had my start as a wagoner. Shouts of "No! Can't be! Nay!" grasped his listeners. He raised his arms again and then continued, in my youth, I was a skilled pugilist and rowdy. Now, settle down, 'tis true, I say, a rowdy. A quarter century past, in the springtime, I was delivering a wagon load of goods to Fort Chiswell, Virginia, when misfortune befell me as a load of bricks. A British lieutenant took grave offense at something I said, and abused me with the most violent of tongues. Such was my spirit at the time. I forthwith clenched my fist and pummeled the officer senseless to the ground. Court-martialed was I, and on the very spot. Sentenced to 500 lashes, I say, being immediately stripped of my shirt and laid into by the thumps of a strong boy. I counted each sting as my flesh was laid to ribbons. When the terrible punishment was met, the sorry Britons missed the allotment by one. 499 lashes only have I received. They owe me one still. With that last testimony, he stripped away his jacket and shirt, turning this way and that, allowing all to bear witness to the truth of his words. The scars upon Morgan's back struck Liam as a monstrous tragedy. The witnesses went dead silent. Replacing his garments, Morgan once more addressed the crowd. "Tomorrow I shall pay them back for every stroke. Let them try to bring the last. The glory of victory shall be ours." The militia erupted in cheers that could not be stayed. Morgan placed his hands on Liam's shoulders and bent to speak in his ear. "May God be with you and grant I see you in good health at the end of this campaign. I'm off to hearten the other companies." Morgan called his entourage to him. They formed a vanguard and ushered him out of the excited camp. Upon seeing General Dan on his way, Colonel Brandon called for Chad to play Tapatoo, a single cadence Liam had yet to learn. It was a call for the soldiers to retire to their quarters and sleep. Liam suddenly longed for his bedroll. It had been the most tiring day of all 13 unlucky years ascribed to his name. Would he live to see another? I hope that you've enjoyed this video and that it inspired you to read Ford the Pacholet, or visit Cowpens National Battlefield, or perhaps just get into studying your ancestry. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please like it, and thanks for watching.